Welcome everyone that's joined us online. I believe you're over there. Um, we currently have folk filing in as we speak, which is cool. This is the first hybrid event I've ever taken part in. Um, and yeah, it gives us great pleasure to welcome you all here for another AES Cambridge section / UK section talk. And tonight we have great pleasure to have our discussion brought to you by Ian Shepherd, who is, I believe, going to be talking about mastering in the modern era. So yeah, just to say thank you very much, everyone. Actually, folks that are joining us in the room, folks that have joined us abroad, maybe online or whatever. Thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your support. Always get in touch with us and let us know what you like, what you don't like. That'd be great. So yeah, less babbling from me, more content from Ian. So, without further ado, Ian Shepherd. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everybody for coming and joining us online. So I will now attempt to share my screen so that you can see my slides. There we go. Okay, so yes, this talk is called Mastering in the Streaming Era, and I'm going to talk about how mastering has changed since I started working in it, certainly, and sometime before, in the last 25 years or so, and also how it hasn't changed. I'm going to talk about what we do about it, now that CD and vinyl are now very much minority formats, and whether we should change the way that we master and the results that we're trying to get. I'm going to talk about how much streaming services change the sound of what we supply, if at all, and if there's anything we need to do about it. I'm going to talk about loudness and how loud we should master, whether there are targets that we need to meet for online streaming or not, and whether there's any advantage to being louder anymore in the 21st century. I'm going to explain my own approach to getting the best possible results mastering online and for all the formats, and briefly about the way in which it can be a challenge to persuade our clients to go along with those, what I consider to be the best practices. But before we get into all of that, I think we should do a brief introduction explaining what mastering is. And now it won't, oh yes, there we go. So I have three ways of explaining to people what mastering is. There's the short and sweet version, the slightly longer version, and the technical version. The short and sweet version is to just say that mastering is making the music sound the best it can be. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that meant over the years in a minute. But in brief, it's about optimizing it for the delivery format, whatever that might be, whether it's vinyl or cassette or CD or online streaming. And also, these days, it typically involves some processing. You try and have empathy for what the artists and the producers, the production team are trying to achieve, and make sure that they get as close to that as possible. So understand what they were trying to do and get them closer to that. The slightly more long-winded explanation is to say that mastering is a little bit like Photoshop for audio. So everybody these days has a camera on their phone, and every so often you get an image that you think is good enough to share, either maybe online or perhaps put into a photo book to give to somebody as a gift, or print a few out and put them on the wall. When you're taking that photograph, you take the best possible photograph you can of the best possible subject, a great landscape, or an interesting or attractive person, or some kind of interesting piece of art. You try and choose decent lighting conditions. You probably have the best quality phone that you can get. You take the best image that you can. When it comes time to share it, we often look at that image again and think, well, it's not quite as good as I was hoping that it would be. And that's when you might pull it into Photoshop. So the kind of thing you can do in Photoshop is adjust the contrast and the brightness. You can change the crop of the image. You can possibly remove any minor flaws that might be in there. There's even software, that if there's somebody spoiling your landscape shot, you can even clone them out so that you can't see them anymore. And mastering is very much the same for audio. So as recording engineers and producers, we make the best possible recording we can. We choose the best musicians that we can, the best mics that we can with the best instruments. We find a great space to record them. We use the best equipment that we possibly can to get the best possible result as we're recording it. Then we mix it to get the best possible result. And even then, after all of that, we've all had the experience of taking it out and playing it in the car, or playing it to a friend on maybe a smart speaker, or just putting it on their hi-fi, and it doesn't sound quite the way that we wanted. And that's the stage where mastering can come in, because we can adjust things like the EQ, the overall tonal balance, the amount of bass and treble. That's similar to adjusting the color balance of a photograph, so the green, red, blue levels, those kind of things. We can adjust the overall loudness of it and the contrast between the different sections of a piece of music, which is similar to adjusting the brightness and contrast of a photograph. You can even go in and try and remove clicks, thumps, bumps if somebody kicked the microphone stand, buzz from a guitar amp, hiss, possibly distortion, other faults. And that's like maybe erasing the person you didn't want from your landscape photograph. So that's the slightly longer explanation of what mastering is, and the technical one, which I won't go into in great detail, is literally creating a production master that meets the technical specifications of the format. This is the aspect, well, I was going to say this is the aspect that's changed most over the years. I think the other thing that has changed is perhaps when mastering started, it was only about optimizing for the format. It was about simply preserving the original mix as closely as possible. Even by the point that the Beatles were releasing their later albums, there were notes on the tape boxes saying, 3 dBs of bass, cut the treble, different adjustments to the sound to get the best possible results when cutting in those days to vinyl. So let's talk a little bit more about vinyl, because it's an interesting example. The optimization that you had to make for a vinyl format had a lot to do with the length of the side. Vinyl is a plastic disc with a groove cut into it. The longer running time you want for one side of a record, the tighter those grooves have to be packed together. And the tighter the grooves are packed together, the less space there is for the needle to vibrate, and therefore the less loud you can make the cut. Now, the vinyl has a lathe, has an analog computer that optimizes the layout of those grooves and packs them as closely together as possible. But even so, there is a physical limit. I remember showing my age, I had Live After Death by Iron Maiden on vinyl back in the day, and the reason it springs to mind is that every side, I think, was over 25 minutes running time, which was very, very long in those days, and it was a relatively quiet vinyl cut. So the side length is important. So are the gaps between the songs and the scrolls, which is when you look at a record, you can see the gaps between the songs where the needle moves across more quickly so that you can drop the needle in. You had to think very carefully about the high frequency balance. Vinyl has pre-emphasis and de-emphasis curves going onto the disc to get the best possible playback quality and minimize surface noise. So that would be an important part of it. And related to that was de-essing. If you have lots of S's in the sound, there's a very high frequency and very high energy, and because of that pre-emphasis curve when you're cutting, they can distort very easily. So de-essing was an important part of the equation for vinyl. The overall loudness was very important in terms of, if you try and cut something too hot, you could risk burning out the cutting head on the lathe, and they are extremely expensive. These days they are extremely rare, so nobody wants to do that. And finally, something that I had not considered until I started talking to vinyl cutting engineers, even the running order has an influence in the sound on vinyl, because as the needle gets closer to the center of the record, the high frequency response suffers. So if you try and cut a loud trebly song towards the end of a vinyl side, you will get a result that's not as satisfying, doesn't sound as good as if it was a cut at the beginning. So you'll often find with lots of vinyl albums that the sides will end with quieter, less energetic productions. With CD, a lot of those physical limitations of the format, and I'll come back to those physical limitations, went away. Suddenly we have a digital format. It's an exact numerical duplicate of the master that was made and sent to the plant for pressing. So really the only absolute limit was the 0 dB peak level at the top of the digital meters that we used. You don't want that to, well, CD had a standard called the Red Book standard. You didn't want to push those meters into clipping to hit 0, because the master would be rejected by the plant. So with that in mind, you could cut any loudness you liked to a CD. And of course, we all know that over the years, the level that was pressed onto CDs and over the years got louder and louder, the so-called loudness wars. And you also had to worry about things like metadata, so song titles, artist details, the start and end times of the songs, and every CD masters were supplied on huge video cassettes, and every one of them had to have an error check. So I remember many a time sitting there listening to the master analyze, and in the last 5 minutes it would ping an error and you'd have to start the whole thing again, which was very frustrating. These days, in some ways, the limitations are even fewer. I'm not aware of any streaming service that rejects files for having clipping or any other kind of technical issue. If you supply the file, it's up to you to get it right. They will put it online, it will get streamed. The advantage is that, unlike with the CD, where you probably had a minimum of 1,000 pressed, with streaming, if there's a problem, you can usually replace the file, which is an advantage. Loudness is still an issue because of the pressures that artists and engineers feel about the loudness wars, but also because the streaming services, in order to minimize the data rate, the bandwidth of the signals that they are streaming, use lossy data compression, or data encoding is a better word, so as we don't confuse it with dynamic compression, so compression and limiting that we use for artistic reasons. And I'll talk more about the codecs in a minute, but that's another factor that we have to, well, I think it's important to pay attention to when we're mastering, knowing that music is going to be streamed. And then we have things like the file format that is required for upload, what the sample rate should be, the bit depth, those kind of technical issues. And again, we have metadata, although that's not really the responsibility of the mastering engineer these days. So if you have, artist track details, ISRC codes, all kinds of artwork, other information that can be included online, that's usually uploaded separately. It's not embedded into the files these days. So another important difference about streaming and the way that it's affected the music industry is simply the way that people listen. We listen to music differently these days. Albums are far less important. Back when you had vinyl, you put on side A, you'd listen to it, you'd flip it, you'd listen to side B. Even when you had a CD, it was much more common to put the CD in and listen to an album all the way through. These days, it's much more likely that people will skip songs or put them into playlists or listen to playlists, or that they will simply hit shuffle and listen to the songs in a random order. We listen on mobile devices these days. I had a Walkman back in the day, a handheld cassette player, but you had one tape that you took with you. It wasn't the same. And we listen on earbuds often and phone speakers. So the chances of somebody listening to your music on a hi-fi, on a carefully curated, carefully chosen set of different components, speakers, amplifier, player, all the rest of it, it's very unlikely these days. And another important difference, as I say, is that loudness is managed when we listen to music online. So one of the things that people get most annoyed about when they're listening to music on radio, on TV, but also when streaming, is if there are sudden changes in loudness. People don't like it to be blasted by one song that's much louder than another one, and they don't like to be listening to one song and then the next one disappears into the background noise. So the streaming services attempt to improve that experience. They measure the loudness of the material that's being streamed, and most of them, in fact all of them now, by default, certainly all the major streaming services will reduce the level of loud songs to avoid those kind of problems. And this isn't a talk about loudness, but I'm going to talk about loudness a lot because loudness affects everything, all of the factors that we're considering here these days. And that's because of this idea that louder is better. It's something that mastering engineers have known forever, which is that if you play somebody two versions of the same song, one of them is they're identical, but one of them is fractionally louder than the other, people will perceive them as sounding different, and lots of people will choose the louder version and say they have a preference for it. Now, we don't know, that's not a real change that happens in the air, in the sound waves that arrive at our ears. It's nothing to do with the playback system. It happens in our brains. And so it's a psychoacoustic effect. Nobody really understands why, but it might be because evolutionarily speaking, there is a survival benefit to paying more attention to the saber-toothed tiger that's breathing down our neck rather than the one that's over there stalking a herd of gazelles. This one's more dangerous. Our brain makes the sound of it more interesting to us. We're more likely to run sooner. Maybe that's why we like loud sounds, or we at least pay more attention to loud sounds. And that drove the loudness war, because if you wanted your CD to sound better than somebody else's, one thing you could do was simply make it a little bit louder. I've always been skeptical about the importance of that, because the first thing that somebody does when they put a CD in a player or a record on a turntable is adjust the volume so that it's comfortable for them, depending on what they're, are they sitting down to listen to it carefully, or are they cooking at the same time, or is it a dinner party, or are they at a club, whatever. The user sets the loudness level. But in the early 90s in particular, CD jukeboxes became popular, especially in bars and clubs. So a huge CD player that could take 200 or so discs, and any song could be played in any order. People would just go up and choose what they wanted to listen to. So it's like shuffle on a phone or some other kind of media player. And in that situation, maybe there was a benefit to your song just being that little bit louder to kind of catch people's attention over the surrounding noise, or just make it sound a little bit better than someone else. That's certainly one of the justifications. Another justification was often that it would sound better on radio. That is, in my experience, basically a myth. All of the major radio stations use broadcast processing. It's important to radio stations that their signal is strong so that people can still hear what's going on, even in areas where there's low or poor reception. I'm talking about analog FM radio. So they would crank the level up at the output in order to make sure that that didn't happen. And so even if there were minor differences in level between songs that went on the radio, they would get evened out. Lots of the DJs would also adjust the levels themselves. So the idea of loudness, that louder is better, caught on even nonetheless, and drove the loudness war, which is just the kind of gradual increase over the years of music getting louder and louder and louder. So just to give you a rough idea, we measure loudness in loudness units, LUFS, loudness units full scale. It's actually surprisingly difficult to measure loudness. LUFS isn't a perfect system, but it's not bad. It's certainly better than the previous methods that we've used in the audio industry. So when I started mastering, you probably saw on the screenshot at the beginning, and you'll see again in a minute when I show you an example. I was trained to judge loudness using a VU meter, an analog meter that measured the average level of the audio. And those VU meters have to be calibrated. And the meter was calibrated so that 0 was at -14 RMS. So if you had a test tone that you ran through the system at -14 on a digital scale, it would read 0 on the VU meter. And that was in the early 90s. By the end of the 90s, I had recalibrated my VU meter to be, I think, -11, -10 possibly. So 4 dBs louder. And at that point, records started coming out like the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication, for example. I remember listening to the first Portishead album and thinking how amazingly loud it was. And with that calibration, the meters would peg. So the needles would just slam into the... And that was the point where I personally decided that I wasn't going to follow this trend any further. I felt that going any louder compromised the sound of the music and that I wasn't going to be part of that race anymore. But the levels kept going. So if you imagine -14 is where we started, these days it's very common to have music at -8, -6, and some EDM and metal and some country, bizarrely enough, can get up to -4 LUFS. So 10 dBs louder over the 20 or so years in between. And the thing that's frustrating for me about that is, as I mentioned, there's no benefit. There's no benefit if somebody adjusts the volume control. There's no benefit on radio. There's certainly no benefit in broadcast where the loudness is regulated. And there's no benefit on streaming anymore because of loudness normalization. Now, I have a demonstration of normalization, which I'll show you next, but I'll just make my final point for this slide, which is at least 70% of the music we hear online is normalized. It's very difficult to judge this. It's very difficult to get accurate figures, but something like 500 million users for the music streaming services. So YouTube Music, Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, all of those. And of those, they're all normalized by default. And I have an unofficial figure that only 17% of people actually go into the settings and disable that. Apple Music used not to turn loud music down, but now they do. But even so, those statistics don't really count for anything, because the factor that everybody misses when they're talking about normalization is that the main place that people listen to music online is YouTube. Not YouTube Music, but YouTube Video. And the number of users, not the total number of YouTube users, but the numbers that I found, the number of people watching music on the YouTube Video platform is 2 billion, which is 2,000 million. So that's 4 times as many people watching and listening to music on YouTube Video than on all the other streaming services combined. So regardless of how many people disable, and on YouTube it can't be disabled. So if you upload a super loud song to YouTube, it will be reduced in level in the way that I'm going to show you. So that's why I say YouTube dominates the market. The idea of that graphic there is that the large blue circle is YouTube, which has a green tick saying loud music is turned down. The smaller circle is the other 500 million people using each of the dedicated streaming services, and only Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and a good portion of the others all normalize. So only that tiny little slice there with the red cross don't normalize their audio. So I have a demonstration that I can play to you that shows normalization in action, because I think it's very persuasive to hear the effect that it can have. So hopefully that will play if I click this button. So this is a playlist that I set up in Spotify some years ago now, and it's called Loudness Wars, and it brings together some contrasting examples of louder and more dynamic songs by the same artist or that are similar to each other. So I'm going to use Metallica for this demonstration, but we also have Eminem versus Kanye West, Jack White versus Jack White in The White Stripes, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Christina Aguilera, Deadmau5 versus Skrillex, and a couple of Radiohead tracks there. And the first thing to show you is that I have the same preferences here as the default settings in Spotify. So when you install this afresh, normalize volume is enabled by default. I haven't changed that. Most people, only 17% of users do change that. So I will just play you these 2 Metallica examples and skip between them so that you can hear how they sound with normalization enabled, and then I'll disable it for you. So this first song is Holier Than Thou from the Black album, and then we'll hear some of Broken, Beat and Scarred from Death Magnetic. So hopefully you can hear and see there that the loudness of both of these examples is similar with loudness normalization enabled. You can see on my dynameter plugin over here that the dynamics are very different. That's perhaps something we could talk about later. But now I want to disable that option in the preferences and let you hear the difference when normalization is disabled. So let's do that. So there you go. I don't know if you were watching the VU meters down on the left-hand side. Obviously, that's a plug-in emulation, but those are calibrated to -11 at 0. So when normalization was enabled, Spotify and YouTube and Tidal all use a loudness normalization distribution loudness of -14. So the needles were down at kind of the -3 level, and then you saw them. I mean, that was the 10 dB of extra gain in real files. So my conclusion from this is that the LUFS level of music doesn't have to be high for streaming. I'm not saying it shouldn't be high. I like loud music as much as anyone else. I love loud music. I love progressive metal anyway, and dance music, which needs to be loud. But there's no benefit to going beyond a certain point online. There are reasons to make music very loud that are aesthetic as opposed to technical, because the LUFS measurement is just a technical measure of the actual level on the disc. I mean, if you think about the examples of a solo flute, for example, you can crank that right up. It's still a gentle, soft sound. Our brains still know that it's a quiet sound. You can take a heavily distorted drums and guitar and turn them way down. The level is low, but our ears still know that they're loud sounds. So there's much more to sounding loud than just measuring loud. But if you do go beyond a certain point in the technical sense online, then loud music is going to be turned down. And there's a phrase that I think Bob Katz, who's a well-known mastering engineer in the US, came up with. It's not how loud you make it, it's how you make it loud. So simply increasing the level will not necessarily give you something that sounds loud. It's all to do with creative uses of distortion and saturation and compression and limiting, possibly clipping, and a myriad of other music production techniques that go into getting the result that you want. So I mentioned that I was going to talk about loudness targets. We know that most of the major streaming services have a distribution loudness of -14 LUFS. So if the music is louder than that, they will turn it down. Lots of people say, therefore, that they think we should aim for that loudness, that it's a requirement. And my answer to that is a resounding no. Except for broadcast. If you want stuff broadcast on TV, there are regulations. You have to supply music at the correct level in that situation, but it's kind of a different use case. We don't need to make our music -14 LUFS or any other particular loudness, because the streaming services will adjust it for us. If you supply something at -4, they will turn it down by 10 dB. If you supply it at -8, they'll turn it down by 6. We should be focusing on what the music needs in terms of energy, excitement. Does it make you want to dance? Does it make you want to cry? The creative aspects. And the great thing about normalization is it means that there isn't the pressure that people felt in the past to make things louder than they felt was necessary. I have given this kind of argument to thousands of students and YouTube viewers and people who read my website over the years, and I regularly get emails from people just saying, thank you. You know, when I understood this, when I realized that I didn't have to hit -8 LUFS or whatever the imaginary target was for my music online and could just make it sound good, suddenly I was getting the results that I wanted. So I count that as a success. Unfortunately, as I'll talk about it a little bit later, many more people are still convinced that these things are needed to make music sell more copies or to sound right, to be competitive. And there's actual research that shows that none of these things stand up. None of them are correct. But nonetheless, particularly musicians and producers and engineers. You know, I mentioned that, let's call it 20%. Let's say it's more than 13% of people go into the settings and turn normalization off. And let's say that lots of people listen on streaming services rather than YouTube. That's general users. If you ask a group of people, engineers and artists, musicians, producers who are here or watching this online, something like 75 to 80% of them will tell you, well, I turn that off. I want to hear the original audio. I want to hear what it really sounds like. And I completely understand that. They say that because they care about the way that the music sounds. But that means they're listening to it in a way that most people don't hear it. So they're chasing this goal of loudness because they think it's important. And actually, the vast majority of people won't notice. I mean, there's even research, Sound on Sound magazine did some tests a while back where they played people things at different loudness levels, and they didn't normalize them. They didn't match them. So literally you'd hear maybe not a difference that big, but certainly 3 or 6 dB of difference between different musical examples. And it had no relevance to the way people felt about the way that it sounded. They still liked the songs that they liked, disliked the songs they didn't like. It didn't factor into, and people have tested this with sales, all kinds of things. It's not necessary, which is very freeing if you understand it, because it means it doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about this stuff in the way that maybe there was some justification for it back in the days of CD, when you were concerned about CD jukeboxes or loudness on the radio, although again, that's something of a myth. So musical decisions are still important, and another reason that that's the case is that loudness is not always matched. I mentioned that all of the major streaming services now will turn down loud music. However, not all of them will turn quiet music up. So YouTube doesn't increase the level of quieter material, neither does Tidal. Spotify won't do it now if it would cause clipping. So just to get really technical for a second, if you have peak levels at -1 dB true peak and your loudness is at -20, you're 6 dB there below their distribution loudness level, but they won't turn it up because to do that would cause clipping. So that means that if we make artistic decisions about whether one song should be louder or softer than another, they will be retained. And that's important because, I mean, something I haven't said yet, it makes no sense to make an acoustic ballad the same loudness as Metallica. One of them is meant to be quiet and gentle, and the other one is meant to be super loud. So that's another reason why mastering to targets doesn't make any sense. Why would we master an acoustic ballad to -14 as well as a metal song? It doesn't make any sense. And another reason is album normalization. So if you listen to music in shuffle or in a playlist on most of the services, they will make the loudness of all the songs similar. But if you listen to an album, they understand that there's meant to be that artistic variation between different songs in the running order, so they retain those differences. So they will simply say, okay, what's the loudest song? We'll turn everything down, so you keep the song by song progression. So you listen to the album, you still hear it as the artist intended, which is a great thing. And I'll talk about this more in a little while, but Tidal actually do that all the while, even if you're listening in shuffle or to a playlist. And then the final factor is that loudness has an impact on the encoding quality, the lossy encoding, the streaming, the data encoding of the files. which brings us on to the topic of streaming codecs. So there are lots of different types: AAC, Ogg Vorbis, Opus. There's a new one announced from Meta that used to be Facebook just recently that they claim will get the files even smaller and still sound amazing. And I think more importantly, lots of the services are now offering lossless files, so CD quality or higher streaming. Apple Music offer it, Tidal offer it, Qobuz offer it, and I think Spotify maybe. If they haven't done it, they will be doing it soon, I'm sure. All of these codecs have the same goal. They want to reduce the data bandwidth. They want to make very large music files smaller so that you can stream them to your phone without using up your data allowance, and also so that you'll get an acceptable result when the bandwidth reaching the phone is poor, if you've only got 3G or whatever. The codecs are remarkably successful, really, when you think that 128 kilobit per second MP3 is throwing away 9/10 of the data of the original file. It doesn't throw away 9/10 of the sound, thankfully. I think probably only 10% perhaps of the sound is lost. It's quite subtle. It still sounds like the same song. You can still hear everything in the arrangement was originally there. It's not perfect. You get artifacts from encoding, especially at low data rates. Bobcat describes them as space monkeys. My old colleague Nick Watson from Fluid Mastering describes them as swirling metallic birdies. I always think it sounds a little bit like somebody is playing chime bars along with the music to do with the transients. And even higher quality encodes, in the best data encoded files, can sound softer or grainier or mulchier, to use a technical term, and you lose this sense of 3D space and depth in them. Lossy codecs eat reverb and spatial cues, so that's one of those things that all of these things you don't notice them until you notice them, and then you can't unnotice them. And I vividly remember the first time I used a kind of A/B comparison between an encoded and the lossless file. I think it was for a Björk album, and it just, the amount of depth that came back, it was subtle, but it was really important. I mentioned, going into this, talking about codecs, loudness makes streaming codecs sound worse, and that's because the encoders work with something called perceptual coding. So roughly speaking, they split the audio into something like 60 different EQ bands. The algorithm analyzes those, figures out which are most important, and throws away most of them and leaves the rest. And that happens moment by moment all the way through the song. So what that means is the algorithm has a hard time figuring out what is important and what's not when everything is loud. If you think of classical music or maybe acoustic jazz, there's a lot of dynamic variety, there's a lot of space in the mix, there's lots of kind of empty air that the codec can get rid of, and everything that's left is all of the important stuff. If you want a really challenging test for an encoder, give it a choir singing full tilt, because it's the full frequency spectrum, the volume is high, it's a big sustained sound, it's very complex in the stereo image, and most codecs will really struggle with that kind of material. Recording of rain is also challenging. I found that out a couple of days ago when somebody had added a rain sound effect to their track, and the only thing they could send me was an MP3 file. The other thing that can happen when you think about all that processing that went into taking the original file and turning it into the much smaller encoded file, when you play it back, it sounds remarkably like the original, but the peak levels inevitably change, which is not that surprising. But if the file is peaking up near 0, you can actually get the decoded file peaking above 0, sometimes as much as 2 or 3 or more dBs. Now, that wouldn't be a problem if you could then turn the file down to make headroom for those peaks, but actually several of the most mainstream decoders don't do that. They immediately reduce the encoded file back down to 24-bit, the decoded file back down to 24-bit, and in the process they slice all of those new peaks off. So you could have a recording that had clipping originally, it was encoded, which introduces new peaks, and then you add another layer of clipping on top of that, and then you could even potentially have extra clipping introduced by the digital to analog converter at the end of the chain. So This is why Spotify, there's a lot of debate about this online, recommend that if you're going to master louder than -14, you should actually leave 2 dB of true peak headroom at the top of the file. I personally think that's a little bit on the conservative side. The loudest stuff I master tends to be -11, -10, and I keep my true peaks at -1, and they sound fine to me, and they're not clipping. But it's an ironic thing that the higher you push the loudness underneath that peak level, the more important it is to turn the whole thing down to keep it sounding good. So it's this kind of self-defeating process. It just gets worse and worse. And then finally, the other factor that has changed is the way that we listen to music these days. Listening to shuffle and playlists, skipping songs regularly, not listening to albums, listening on mobile devices and phone speakers. Lots of people conclude from this that we should master listening to things on earbuds and as loud as possible. Because you want it to cut through on little phone speakers, you want it to cut through on earbuds, you want it to cut through the background noise, you want it to stand up in competition with everything else. If everybody's listening to it on earbuds, why should we not? The answer to that is that the lower quality reproduction you have can mask problems in the original. I mean, for example, if you've got a pair of Apple earbuds, there's no bass. So there could be enormous bass problems happening and you just wouldn't know it. So as mastering engineers, we need to master on high quality systems, and those masters will then translate well to all of the lower quality systems. And no, things don't have to be mastered as loud as possible. I've made this point several times, but I just wanted to mention the research done by Elko Grimm at HKU in the Netherlands. He set up 2 different playlists with deliberately chosen music of very widely ranging loudness. One of them was track normalized, so every song had the same loudness level going through, so the acoustic ballads were lifted up and heavy metal was turned down. The other one was album normalized, track by the loudest track, meaning that they would measure the loudest song on an album and then everything would be scaled relative to that to keep the artistic differences. I was part of this. I just listened to it in the background while I was doing other things, and I found that listening to the one that was track normalized, every so often I'd suddenly go, that doesn't sound right. Something's not right there. That feels wrong musically. Whereas listening to the one that was album normalized, even though it was shuffled, it was random playback order, that happened much less. It was much more musically satisfying. And about 80% of the people who did that test decided that they would prefer to listen to album normalized music as well. And that has actually, down the bottom there, you can see that's been adopted as a recommendation. The AES make, as you know, recommendations and regulations for many different aspects of the audio industry, including how to measure RMS correctly, but I won't go down that rabbit hole. And TD 1008 is the updated set of guidelines for streaming services. It's important that they're for streaming services. They are for Spotify and Apple Music and everybody else. The first version used the word target 64 times, I think. And I argued very strongly that that should be removed from the new version because it confused people. It contributed to that idea that we had to aim for this target. It's now called the distribution loudness, which I think is a much better name because it explains clearly that that's what Apple or Spotify or YouTube are going to do with the music. It doesn't mean we have to. It's still important that we pay attention to it. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but it doesn't mean that we have to hit those targets. So let's finish off. Actually, that's a huge amount of information. My recommendations for how to get the best results mastering in the 21st century. So we don't need extreme loudness anymore unless it's for creative purposes. It feels right for the genre or it needs something associated with extreme loudness. Musical relationships between songs are still important, even in shuffle and playlists. Lots of songs are intended to sound quieter than others, so the more we can preserve that, the better. And actually, some mastering engineers have started mastering following the tidal model, where the loudest song on an album is at -14, even if that leaves some spare peak headroom, and then everything else is scaled relative to that. The thing that fascinates me about that is that they have very happy clients, despite everybody who tells me, oh no, you have to master things super loud in order to to keep people happy. And as well as that, it has the added advantage that it will then work even on a service like YouTube that doesn't turn up quieter songs, because the original relationships are all maintained. So as I say, the great news is that you can make musical choices for loudness these days and not have to worry about other people just mastering stuff much louder and your music suffering in comparison. Recommendations for optimizing that loudness, I would say true peaks at -1, so that you have, this is an analogy that my co-host on the Mastering Show podcast, John Tidy, introduced me to. I don't know whether he came up with it, but when you fill up a mug of coffee, you don't fill it right to the top. And that's because if you do, when you start moving it around, you're going to slop it and scald your hand. Same thing applies to digital audio. Put a little bit of sloppage room at the top. A dB is enough, just so that any kind of processing like streaming, encoding, or maybe minor level changes that might happen, there's some room for that to be done cleanly without any problems down the line. I recommend you avoid extreme loudness, by which I mean louder than -10 LUFS. I haven't dug into the whole issue of short-term and integrated loudness. Integrated loudness is for an entire file, and those are the kind of numbers I've been talking about so far. But you can also, the graph that we saw in the demonstration of loudness over time is the short-term loudness. If you have a song that has a short-term loudness of -10 all the way through, the integrated loudness, the overall loudness, will be roughly -10. If it has much more variety, you'll get an overall level that's lower. So it's important to pay attention to both of those. The integrated loudness tells you what's going to happen to it when it's measured and managed by streaming services. But the short-term loudness tells you what happens at the loudest moments. And you can just see there a display on my Dynameter plugin. The orange section there and tickling into the red, the loudness there is up at -9, which is pretty loud. So then there's 8 dBs of difference in between that and the peak level, which I think is about as far as you would want to go. It's fine for short periods, but beyond that, I feel then you get into the land of diminishing returns, where you start to lose life and energy and everything starts to sound overcooked. It's really important, though, having said we can master musically, that we check that we're happy with the results. You need to understand streaming services are going to reduce loud songs to this level of -14. So we need to preview our music with that in mind. You listen to the album as you've mastered it, but then also you listen to it and think, okay, how would that sound if it was mastered at -14? Now you could either measure the music using a loudness meter and make those adjustments yourself in a DAW, or you can use a website that I set up with meter plugs called Loudness Penalty. So loudnesspenalty.com, you just drag the file you want to measure onto the browser. It doesn't get uploaded. It doesn't get stored. Everything happens on your computer. It's completely secure. And after a few seconds, it will show you what will happen in terms of loudness changes to that on a range of the most popular music streaming services. And that's interesting, but even more important is that you use the preview button. I don't have a screenshot of the next page of the results page, but there's a play button. So you can listen to it and it will play it to you, turned down by 2 dBs or 3 dBs, whatever the decision was for the platform you're interested in. You can open multiple files in different tabs and preview. You could have one master that was louder, one master that was more dynamic. You could have them both open in tabs, hear them both at -14 or whatever the distribution loudness was, and decide which one you prefer. Can you hear a difference? Do you prefer one or the other? If the louder one sounds just as good to you, then you might go with that. But maybe you prefer something about the more dynamic version, which will have a lower level. And as far as I'm concerned, you can ignore codecs. That might sound a bit controversial given that there's lots of codec checkers and all the rest of it, but they already sound pretty good. They're improving all the time. You know, there are new codecs coming out, there's new technology. They're constantly changing and they're not even consistent. There are about 3 different codecs that might get used if you stream something from YouTube, depending on whether you're on a mobile, what the data bandwidth is in the area where you're listening to it, or which quality setting you choose. There's a bunch of different variables that change the file that you're actually being delivered. So if there are changes to the sound because of that, optimizing for one makes no sense, because that might not work for one of the others. I think it's better to just say, especially since everything is likely to be going lossless in the near future, you know, as bandwidth increases, the telephone companies and the streaming services want us to use lots of data. They're going to encourage everybody to go lossless, so you can hear the original audio quality. You don't have to worry about the codecs at all. Now, all of that is fine, but you will find if you try and address some of these issues with your clients that you're going to meet with some resistance, especially from the major the major record companies, people who are not directly well, I was going to say people who are not directly involved with the music, like A&R managers and label executives. Actually, maybe that's not true, because as I say, often the people who care most about it are the artists, the engineers, the producers, and they're the people who've turned off normalization and are concerned about the differences in loudness, but nobody ever hears them, or certainly doesn't hear them in the same way. And that's why I say that no one else cares. Briefly, I might mention, in the last year or so, we've had this surge of interest in spatial audio. Apple have been promoting it heavily. So the idea of Dolby Atmos, where you can have a surround sound mix streamed, but also you can have an emulation of surround sound, a binaural emulation on earbuds, because that single file could be played on such a wide range of playback systems. Dolby have specified that the loudest songs on there should be no louder than -18 LUFS, so substantially lower even than I was mastering back in the 90s. What that means is that people are able to master with much more in the way of dynamics, and I have a pet theory that one of the reasons people like the sound of Atmos so much is, yes, it's to do with the spatial aspects, but it's almost, I think it's just as likely that a lot of what they like about it is the extra dynamics. The fact that you can have more bass, and that bass can move more, that you can have more contrast, you can have more dramatic builds, the drops can be louder. I'd like to see that tested. I need to think of a way of doing that. Maybe that's a project for some students at some point. So you can show people loudness penalty. You can give them examples. You can say, okay, here's the loud version, here's the quiet version. Preview them both yourself, see how they sound. That's how they're going to sound online. Some people find that persuasive. You can talk to them about spatial audio and the fact that if somebody is listening to a spatial audio binaural emulation on their iPhone or whichever device, they can flick instantly to the stereo version. It will be normalized, the loudness will be matched, and often the stereo doesn't sound anywhere near as good. So my hope is that over time, more and more people are going to be exposed to dynamic masters and mixes, decide they like them, and choose to go that direction with their own stuff. I mean, it also seems to me, if you're going to make a really dynamic Atmos master, why would you make a super crushed stereo master? So it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time. You could show them some positive examples. If you go to dynamicrangeday.com/award, every year I run an event called Dynamic Range Day where I talk about loudness, say things like the points that I've been mentioning in this talk. Every year we give an award to a great sounding, dynamic, but also commercially successful and mainstream album. And you can see all of the past nominees there. So there's maybe 100 or so songs or albums up there that were mastered with decent dynamics, maybe not exceptional dynamics, but not super crushed, and they sound fantastic, and they've sold in bucket loads. For example, the Daft Punk album from a few years ago. So to summarize, this talk was going to be about what has changed, what's different about mastering in the streaming era, and the answer is everything, but also nothing or not much, because you can still master with dynamics. It's still about making the music sound the best that it can be. The technical requirements have changed, but what worked back in the early 90s still works these days. I mean, I'm lucky because the point where I stopped adjusting my VU meter, where I said, okay, I'm not going to go any louder, when I master music so that the VUs are hovering around 0 and pushing up +1, +2, those files work really well on streaming. They're right in what I consider to be the loudness sweet spot. And there's a reason for that, which is that the engineers who designed the loudness normalization algorithms for these streaming sites looked at the music that was there. And they saying to themselves, we need something that works for Metallica's Black Album as well as Death Magnetic. And therefore we need enough headroom that we can normalize the Black Album successfully. So they take real world numbers from albums that sound, amazing albums from the past, like Back in Black by AC/DC or Pink Floyd albums, whatever they might be. And those are the numbers that they're using. So stuff that works well musically also works well on streaming. And ironically, it also, those same rules, guidelines, apply to vinyl as well. I often like to master music imagining that it's going to be released on vinyl. Quite a lot of it still is, and then when it gets taken to vinyl cutting engineer, I'm often told that it's cut flat, which I take as a compliment. But yeah, a lot of the, well again, vinyl, CD is a format, or digital audio is a format with almost infinite possibilities, and it's up to us to choose the ones that sound musically great. Vinyl is a format with very limited technical possibilities in terms of signal to noise ratio, dynamics, all that stuff. And it was a question of getting the music to sound as good as possible in that format. And in the process of getting vinyl to be good enough to have great sounding music, they stretched those physical limitations to the point where the music sat very happily in it. So if you make your music so that it'll sit happily on vinyl, it'll sit very happily everywhere else. So the short summary is, don't worry, be happy, or keep calm and carry on. And yeah, aim for one master to rule them all. One master, you don't have to optimize for this streaming service or that, or make one loud version, one soft version. Just make a master that sounds fantastic, and hopefully everybody will like it. There you go.
All right, thanks very much. I don't want to unceremoniously shift you aside.
That's okay. I just got to figure out how to stop sharing now.
Yeah, fair enough. Brilliant. All right, we're back on. Cool. All right, I just wanted to say a couple of things if that's all right, because I forgot at the start to do my round of thanks, so I'll do it now. First of all, thanks to ARU for accommodating us tonight. A massive thanks to Bill Campbell, Archie Hazel, and our technician here, Mark Pickering, for doing the setup and making everything possible. Thanks very much indeed to Sue as well, who's been on here doing the recordings, making sure that everything goes off without a hitch, as much as I try and break that. But I think for now, we're going to be moving on to a Q&A, both here and on the stream. But if we could just once again, a round of applause. Thanks to everyone involved. I mean, especially for a very insightful talk. Thank you very much.